Welcome back to the podcast. I am happy to welcome back Arlen Schumer, the author of The Silver Age of Comic Book Art. Today, we are talking about Neal Adams. For newer fans, what's important about Neal Adams, for people who aren't familiar with Neal Adams?
Neal Adams, when he broke into the comic book field in the late 60s, he brought a photographic realism to the world of superheroes, this fantasy world that a whole generation of comic book readers like me were into. But we had never seen these fantasy heroes drawn so realistically. In fact, he once said that if superheroes really existed, they would look like the way I draw them. So we had never seen Batman be as much of a man as he was a bat. There'd be no Dark Knight today without what Neal Adams did with Batman in 1968. The way our pop culture is now, our fantasy movies with computer graphics, it's all about rendering fantasy worlds realistically. You know where that started before the computer and before Steven Spielberg and before George Lucas? It started with Neal Adams in the late 60s, bringing a realism to comic books, which included fantasy, science fiction, as well as superheroes. What Neal Adams did with the X-Men when he went to Marvel Comics in 1969, after making his bones at DC Comics in 1968, he did a version of the X-Men that is basically what Neal Adams' Batman did for the Dark Knight. Neal Adams' X-Men became the foundation for the modern X-Men, which is the foundation of the Marvel Comics cinematic universe in the 21st century. In the same way, the Dark Knight is the foundation of the DC Comics universe of movies and comic books. But Frank Miller, who did the Dark Knight in 1986, is of my generation, that worshipped at the feet of Neal Adams for what he did in bringing Batman back from the dregs that the camp TV series left him in the spring of 1968. And literally in one issue, in the summer of 68, overnight, Neal Adams transformed Batman from this campy clown into what we know of as the Dark Knight. He restored, he rebooted Batman. He took him back to his 1939 Bob Kane original concept and drew that concept realistically, photorealistically. So we saw Batman looking real as we've never seen him before, 180 degrees away from the campy Adam West version. And without what Neal Adams did, and like I said, Frank Miller was experiencing that as an adolescent, like I was, and a whole generation was. And that's what made Frank Miller do The Dark Knight 2 decades later. Neal Adams' art, his approach to the superhero genre fantasy stories that comic books are, opened the eyes of a generation of filmmakers like Lucas and Spielberg to see these fantasy worlds rendered realistically using the tools of cinema and eventually the computer. But Neal Adams' work, and if you look at the 9 webinars I did on my YouTube channel after he passed away a year ago, I was the only one that really did anything in memoriam of him in terms of his legacy works. DC and Marvel, even his own family, did nothing publicly to honor him when he died. But in those 9 webinars, there's about 15 hours of content. If you want to know what made Neal Adams a living legend, it's there in those 9 webinars. There are 2 webinars on his Batman work. There's a webinar on his Marvel work, on his Green Lantern, Green Arrow work for DC Comics. I have 2 webinars called Eclectica, which is because he did so many side projects for National Lampoon, for the Marvel magazine line, for advertising. He was a true multimedia, multidimensional. He was the greatest artist of his time with the most impact on a whole generation. If you know the work of Bill Sienkiewicz, he is one of our modern masters, and yet he started out in the early 80s as the ultimate Neal Adams clone. In the same way the great Renaissance masters had their schools of artists who followed them in their style, Neal Adams' success spawned a whole generation of comic book artists and inkers who followed him to various degrees of both commercial and artistic success. But nobody was as great a Neal Adams clone, imitator, whatever you want to call it, as Bill Sienkiewicz. But the difference is, after a few years of mastering Adams' style, Bill Sienkiewicz became, he elevated, enlightened, and became the multimedia genius artist he's considered today. And if you're Neal Adams, you can look at a modern Bill Sienkiewicz and still sense a little bit of the Neal Adams style in his work, because he can never shake his own foundation. But he's the only one of the legion of Adams clones who achieved that leap in artistic development. But that's the impact of Neal Adams.
So you had the opportunity to work with Neal Adams during the 80s. Is that correct? What was that like for you?
Wow. Imagine if you had told me when I was, say, 12 years old in 1970, when Neal Adams was God. It's funny, Eric Clapton, in England, there was famous graffiti, Clapton is God, and that's where that expression started. But if in the rock and roll world, Clapton was God, and with the way we revered Jimi Hendrix, Jim Steranko and Neal Adams were the twin gods of comic book art in 1970. And if you had told me then, when I was 12 years old, a young adolescent artist copying Neal Adams and Gil Kane and Infantino and the great DC artists and doing my own 12-year-old drawings, if you had told me, and worshiping Neal Adams and Jim Steranko, if you had told me then, like a ghost of Christmas future, Arlen, one day you will be working for Neal Adams. You will be penciling for him, and he will come in and ink your pencils. Ron, I would have had an adolescent heart attack right there. And yet that dream came true. And I'm very fortunate, blessed. Now, Joe Kubert had his school of comic book art still running in New Jersey. And in the almost 50 years that's been around, the amount of great artists that Kubert has turned out that have become great comic book artists is a long list. And that includes both of his sons, of course. But Neal Adams, in running his commercial art studio starting in the early 70s called Continuity Associates, even though that wasn't a school, it was a commercial art studio, the amount of great artists that came through that studio, I was on the tail end of that in 1986 when I left to go out on my own. But when I got to Neal Adams, which is a whole story unto itself, I remember I worked for him for a little over 2 years, and it was sweatshop hours. It was doing artwork for advertising, storyboards, comps, animatics. And the advertising world back then was 24/7, 365, meeting deadlines, and it was labor intensive. And for a freelance artist starting out in New York City, the money was good, but it was 12-hour days and working weekends and everything. But for the first, I remember, couple of months, just standing next to Neal while he was working or showing us something, I felt that tingling sensation that I'm working for Neal Adams, which, like I said, I remember from childhood, that would have been an impossible reality. And I never thought, oh, I hope one day I can work for Neal Adams. But as great as I held him as an artist, how could I possibly be penciling for him? It was unfathomable, and yet it actually happens. When I look back on it now, I was a couple years out of art school. I went to Rhode Island School of Design, a really good school. And I had worked at other full-time art jobs before I got to Neal. But I knew that once I was done with Neal, whenever that would be, I'd be ready to be on my own as Arlen Schumer, because I figured after you've worked for your childhood idol, who can you work for? And I've been on my own ever since. And to this day, Ron, every now and then when people look at my illustration, if they know Neal Adams' work, they'll say, your work reminds me of Neal Adams, or Arlen, I thought that was a Neal Adams, or Arlen, I can see the Neal Adams influence. Again, if you had told me when I was 12 years old, if I showed you my drawings at 12, when I was struggling to look like Neal Adams at 12 years old, but if you had told me then, Arlen, one day people will be looking at your artwork and thinking it's Neal Adams, or thinking it looks like Neal Adams. So I take that as really an incredible compliment, because I still get that tingling sensation.
So I was doing some research and I came across this interview that ran back in the Comics Journal from 1982. It starts with a quote. It says, Neal Adams cannot be faulted for timidity. What do you think about that introduction? For his timidity.
He wasn't a timid person. He was a man who spoke his mind. He had clout because he was the most in-demand artist, but he used that clout with a conscience to help people like Siegel and Schuster, the Superman creator.
How did he help them?
So somewhere around 1974, I think, Jerry Siegel, the writer of Superman, co-creator with Joe Shuster, in the mid-70s, he was working, I think, as a delivery man in New York City, delivering packages. The artist, Joe Shuster, was, I think, legally blind, living in, I don't know, pretty destitute conditions. And 1974 was when the producers, the Salkins, bought the rights from DC Comics to do what became the Christopher Reeve movie, released in 1978. And at the time, I think they paid $80 million for the rights, which was considered astronomical. Nobody had ever paid anywhere near that. And it made front page news. And Jerry Siegel wrote a real impassioned letter saying what a farce that DC Comics just made $80 million off of something we created and got basically locked out of. And I'm simplifying tremendously, but Neal Adams, that letter got published. He sent it to, I don't know, San Francisco Chronicle at first or something, but eventually made the wires. And Neal Adams read it, and he was blown away in a negative way by, how could this be happening? How could DC Comics, which is owned by Warner Brothers, how could they allow the creators of Superman, regardless of what happened in the past with the court cases they lost? This is analogous to a decade or so later, when the Black Bluesmen finally, their estates hired lawyers, or however it happened, for the lawyers to go after acts like Led Zeppelin, and claiming that all the songs on Led Zeppelin 1, credited to Page and Plant, the foundation of Led Zeppelin, are basically very well done, elaborate covers of original blues songs by the likes of Leadbelly and Son House and all those guys. And guess what? They ended up winning their court cases. And now when you get Led Zeppelin 1, the credits read Page, Plant, Leadbelly. But a decade and a half or whatever, 2 decades before that, Neal Adams used his clout in the comic book industry and being savvy of the real world and how media work and public relations. He got together with people like Jerry Robinson, who was the head of the National Cartoonist Society or something. I forget the organization. But Jerry Robinson was there at the beginning of Batman and co-created the Joker and Robin, and was Bob Kane's first ghost artist, if you know what ghost artist, an uncredited artist that you think is Bob Kane. And so Jerry Robinson was also a giant in the field, but Neal Adams marshaled his forces and basically used public relations and his own clout to shame basically Warner Brothers into doing the right thing, regardless of the past court cases. All those black bluesmen, just like Siegel and Schuster and all those young comic artists, when you got published, when your record was made and distributed, you signed your rights away. So that's how these corporations and record companies were able to keep those copyrights, because they always said, hey, look, they signed the contract. Same thing with Siegel and Schuster. When the first Superman story got published, that was a de facto release of their rights. So technically, of course, all these corporations are correct. But I think what they call it now in legalese is onerous contracts. Modern law is now bent towards restoring the dignity and the integrity of the original artist's claims on the work, and restored judiciously, or maybe that's not the right word, by adjudicating them fresh with this new sensibility, a woke sensibility, as it were, that they're basically remedying. It's a type of reparations for the injustice of the way it was done originally in the past, in the 20th century. So Neal Adams used his clout to get Siegel and Schuster stipends of, I think, $20,000 a year for the rest of their lives, which is still a drop in the bucket. It should have been $200,000 a year, but okay, at least they got something. And their names affixed to every comic book story, movie credits. And now when you see a Superman movie, it'll say created by Siegel and Schuster. When you pick up a Superman comic, somewhere it says created by Siegel and Schuster. And that's what Neal Adams did, using his clout as a great comic artist. I mentioned Spielberg. In the same way Spielberg used his clout to create the Shoah Foundation, to document Holocaust survivors on video, so that all these Holocaust deniers will have to deal with that video. That's an example of a great artist using their artistic clout to make things better. In Hebrew, the phrase is tikkun olam, to repair the world. We all have to do our part in making things better. And Neal Adams used his clout to make things better on so many grounds: the return of original art, getting royalties for reprints, so many things a new generation of comic artists maybe take for granted now would not have happened. One great story, they used to chop up original black and white comic art throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s under the grounds of some kind of tax purposes. Don't ask me even, I have no idea what the details are, but trust me, original comic art, which the artists themselves of that generation did not value. Comic books themselves were not valued like they are today. They're respected and they're written up as great literature. No, back in the 20th century, because of a myriad of reasons, Ron, comics were considered trash. And the great artists who worked in the field, they knew they were making trash, and yet their great abilities, instinctive as great artists, still did not prevent them from creating great artwork. But they didn't think the original art was worth anything. Now the original art goes for sale in Sotheby's for hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Exactly.
And yet they knew that the production departments at DC and Marvel were chopping up the art destroying it for tax purposes. Neal Adams comes along in 1967 at the production offices of DC Comics. He sees a production man taking a stack of original art and starting to chop it. Neal, he went ballistic. He literally leapt across the room and grabbed the guy. Now, Neal was a big guy, and he was fit and he was muscular. And imagine if you've seen Neal Adams, imagining him leaping across a room like a superhero. And he said, if you continue chopping that art up, like I'm gonna, whatever he's threatened him with. That production guy marched right into Carmine Infantino's publisher's office and basically said, who is this young guy threatening me physically for doing the job I'm hired to do? So Infantino calls in Neal Adams, and Neal Adams says, Carmine, this has got to end. This is great artwork. You don't chop up artwork, you return it to the artist. And thus began the saving of original art. And what we have today is an original art market that, like I said, is at home in the great auction houses of Sotheby's and Christie's. And great comic art by Neal Adams and others goes for hundreds of thousands of dollars, as it should. It's great artwork, period. But Neal Adams basically was instrumental in saving it for future generations.
Arlen, I have 1,000 more questions to ask you, but we are running.
1,001 questions with Arlen Schumer.
But we are supposed to be doing a short form podcast.
What the? Hey, well, we packed it in. There was a lot of info I laid out there. Did I not?
Yes, and I hate to say this, but you still get the closing comments. You get last word in. So what's your last comments for the day?
Wow. Neal Adams? Should I make it about Neal Adams?
Let's do something with Neal.
Okay. Like I said, I urge everybody, if they want to know more about what made Neal Adams great, there are 9, count them, 9 webinars on my YouTube channel, which is linked from my website, arlenschumer.com. There's a little YouTube icon. You click on that, you go to my YouTube channel, you will see, because all my webinar videos are chronologically ordered. So if you go back only a year ago, when he passed away in the spring, I created 9 webinars, 15 hours worth of beautiful images, the greatest hits of Neal Adams, according to me. And I give you Neal Adams' legacy works, 15 hours worth, spanning 9 webinars of all of his main bodies of work. The Dead Man work that made his bones, his Batman works, 2 webinars, his Marvel works, his which include X-Men and Avengers, and then his Green Lantern, Green Arrow for DC, which demanded a webinar all its own. His body of Superman work that people don't realize, not only did he do the Superman Ali Treasury Edition, which he considered his greatest work, but even though he never drew Superman regularly in his comic books, he did such a body of extracurricular Superman work that was worth a webinar of its own. And then I think the final 2 webinars I call Eclectica, because he did so much other work for other companies. He did Son of God for National Lampoon. He did so much advertising and licensing art and black and white magazine stories and cover paintings for the Marvel magazines. So there are 2 webinars called Eclectica. And that's future historians, when they want to know what was this guy Neal Adams about, I guarantee you those 9 webinars will become their prime source material, because I have everything about Neal Adams. And there's nothing like what I put together in honor of him as a father figure in my own life, as the man who taught me. My drawing improved 400% working for him. It was like going to graduate school and getting paid for it. So my way of giving back, I've done other interviews with Neal when he was alive. I've done the Neal Adams sketchbook, which is, I think, the greatest sketchbook about any artist ever done, if I do say so myself. But the 9 webinars pull it all together in a way that they're really edutainment. So I think
Arlen.
that's it for my final statement.
Arlen, this has been fascinating. I will have links in the show notes.
Absolutely.
People are into Neal Adams. You need to go check out Arlen's stuff. As you can see, Arlen's extremely knowledgeable. Arlen, the Silver Age of comic book artists. Thank you so much for joining me. We're going to have you on again to talk about something new. Thanks so much.
Ron, thanks for having me as always. Great to be here.